Thank you for joining us today. My name is Maria Tellier. I am the State Director for New Mexico. It is our review of our August meeting with the Alamogordo group, Coffee Cups and Flying Saucers. Since it's August, I thought that we would go over the abduction of U.S. Air Force Sergeant Charles Moody in 1975. Sergeant Moody, a 13-year veteran of the United States Air Force, was stationed at Holloman Air Force Base. He was working swing shift, which is like a middle of the day, got done around midnight, and he was a cargo aircraft mechanic. On August 13th, after finishing his shift, Sergeant Moody decided to drive out onto the desert on his way home and watch the annual Perseid meteor showers before going home to his wife. He had heard how vibrant the meteors were when viewed from the desert, since there was no city light or street lights to interview with his view. The yearly Perseids are visible July to September, but on August 12th and 13th, they are vivid, 50 to 100 meteors per hour, anywhere from 10 p.m. until dawn, and they're often described as green fireballs. So he was looking to the northeast, the area around La Luz, which is just over the Sacramento Mountains, and it was about 1:20 a.m. He was lying on the hood of his Corvette, watching the sky. It was an extremely active evening, beautiful, colorful fireballs against that dark sky. And he thought that one of those fireballs was coming right at him. He saw it coming over the Sacramentos, and he said it was becoming larger and larger, and it was glowing bright, bright white, and it was coming right at him. And just when he thought it was going to hit him or hit near him, he realized he wasn't looking at a fireball at all. He was looking at a gray craft. The craft stopped dead and just hung in the air, 10 to 20 feet off the ground. He estimated it to be about 50 feet across, with a large window in the front, several globes of glass on the bottom, and he could see 2 or 3 humanoid figures looking at him. He jumped off the hood of the car. He ran into the front seat. He tried to start the car, but it would not start. He sat there panicking, and he looked up, and that object was now 50 feet from his windshield, and he began to hear a drilling noise. He described it as sounding like a dentist drill. And then a fog started enveloping inside of his car. He felt his body start to go numb, but he also became very much calm. He felt a calmness coming all over him. And then the next thing he remembers is waking up in the front seat of that car and watching the craft lifting off and leaving the area. He had no memory of what had happened to him after the enveloping of the fog. He even thought maybe that was a dream. But he looked at his watch, and it was 2:45 a.m. He realized he had lost 90 minutes of time while in his car, and he remembers seeing the craft leave the area, and he realized it wasn't a dream. So, but for some reason now his car would start. It started right up, and he got out of there. He headed home. He headed home quickly, and his wife was waiting for him. She was very concerned, and he told her everything about that night in the desert. So a few days later, he was still unable to relieve those 90 minutes, remember those 90 minutes of time. And so he wrote a letter. He wrote a letter to the official UFO magazine. In that letter, he asked them to not contact him at Holloman. He asked them to please call him at his home and to forward his request for help. He needed help with whomever they felt could help him to remember what happened that night for those 90 minutes. So by now it was August 20th. And that's what, 7 days after the incident, and snail mail, but they received his request, and the editor Bernard O'Connor of UFO magazine, he forwarded the information to Jim Lorenzen of APRO, who called the Moody home immediately. And Charles Moody's wife told him, my husband works swing shift, but he desperately needs to speak to you. Can you call back tomorrow? So on August 21st, Jim Lorenzen called, and he spoke with Sergeant Moody directly. But Moody could still just remember the envelopment of the cloud in his car, and then waking up and watching the craft leaving the area. He still could not remember the 90 minutes. But he also told Jim Lorenzen, but he was getting really sick. He was feeling really sick and really ill after that encounter. And Jim Lorenzen told him to go to sick call, but don't tell them what had happened that night in the desert. Sergeant Moody had developed a rash, kind of looked like a heat rash on the lower part of his body, and he said it felt like somebody had hit him all over with a baseball bat. So he went to the doctor, he followed Lorenzen's advice, and he did not tell the doctor about that incident in the desert that night. So the base doctor examined him, and he told him, just go home and get some rest. So, unknown to Moody, Jim Lorenzen had recorded that conversation and sent it for evaluation to the inventor of the PSE, Charles McQuiston. PSE is the Psychological Stress Evaluator. It's a process. It processes the sound of your voice by detecting stress. Stress indicates lying or untruthfulness. So after he evaluated that recording of that conversation, McQuiston found Moody to be truthful, and he advised APRO, that he was telling the truth. He was not lying, and they decided to travel to Alamogordo for an interview in person. So this was just 20 days now after the event. That was September 2nd, 1975. Jim Lorenzen and Wendell Stevens of APRO flew to Alamogordo and interviewed, by now they're calling him Chuck Moody, because Chuck was calling him all the time. He was still very nervous about this. So they found him to be a responsible guy. He was kind, he was conscientious, he was a person who had in fact experienced something that he just could not relate to. He was confusing previously held concepts, and he found this to be very unsettling. Chuck Moody said that he used to think people who saw flying saucers were crazy, and now he was thinking he was crazy, because he was sure he saw a flying saucer. The trip enabled APRO access to the sighting location, and although they didn't find any evidence of a landing, they noticed that Moody changed as soon as he got to that landing area. He became very agitated and nervous and jumpy, and he told them he was having feelings of apprehension and fear. He was full of fear, and while they were there, he told them he just wanted to run away as fast as he could from that area. So they said, let's leave this. There was no evidence of landing, and as soon as they left the area, all those feelings left Moody. So they got him back to his house, and they really knew something traumatic had happened to Sergeant Moody, and he still couldn't remember anything that happened during those 90 minutes. So Moody took APRO to his house, and they interviewed his wife, Karen. Now, Karen was a registered nurse, and she told them that she had a lot of concerns about her husband from that night, and she told them her memories of the evening. She said he came home about 3 a.m., which is very late for him. She knew he was going to be late, but not that late. He looked pale and sick. And he told her everything about the flying saucer while watching the meteor showers. She completely believes him, but she has concerns that he's telling people about it because she's afraid that the Airforce is going to find out and label him as crazy, and he'll lose his clearance. Apro told Moody that eventually, just relax, eventually those memories, they'll come back on their own, and but not to talk to anybody about it. And he didn't listen to him. He looked up an old fishing buddy, Dr. Abram Goldman. He was a flight surgeon with the U.S. Air Force, and that's how Moody knew him. And now he was a civilian neurosurgeon. Moody confided everything to Dr. Goldman about the experience of the 13th, and the doctor advised Moody that maybe he could try a method of meditation or self-hypnosis to restore those lost memories. So he taught Moody how to do that, and Moody began practicing the process taught to him by the doctor, and slowly, very slowly at first, those memories began to surface. And Moody was quite happy about that. He was calling Apro and telling him, I remember this, I remember that. By September 29th, he told them that they were flooding, those memories were flooding back to him. But more importantly, he had just received orders to ship out. They wanted him to leave immediately, but he said, no, I have a home, my wife has a job, my children are in school, I need some time to prepare. So they gave him till November 29th. His leadership gave him to November 29th to sell his home and make make arrangements. So he told Apro that, and they told him, you start writing everything down. Every single thing you remember, write it down. So in November 5th, the Travis Walton was abducted, and Apro became quite entrenched with that. That is, just a few days after speaking to Moody about him shipping out. And they lost a little bit of sight of Moody there because they were preoccupied with Travis Walton. So on November 15th, they received a letter in the mail from Sergeant Moody, a full recall of what had happened to him, and I'll read you a little bit from it. Sergeant Moody began in that letter, what I saw that night on board their craft were things I cannot explain, but I can only try. The inside of the craft was as clean as an operating room. I cannot say if the fixtures were metal or plastic. The lighting was indirect. I did not see any source of light, but there was light. The beings were about 5 foot tall, and very much like us, except their heads were larger, with no hair, ears were small, eyes were larger than ours, their nose was small, and their mouth had a very thin lips. I would say their weight was maybe between 110 and 130 pounds. They were spindly. Their type of clothing was very skin tight. I could not see any zippers or buttons anywhere on that clothing. There were 3 of them. The one I call the elder wore a silver white suit, and the other 2 were dressed all in black. Now Moody recalls lying on that table, and he was unable to move. He could see the indirect lighting above him, and it shone on a white domed roof. When he looked down, he saw there was a rod across his back legs, and it had a glowing light to it. And he was told telepathically by these little creatures that this was administered because he wanted to fight with them. And they used this for him to calm him down. Moody was 6'3", 230. He was a big hunking man, and he was fighting these little spindly creatures. He was told by them not to touch the rod, but if he behaved, they would remove it. Now, Moody had Air Force training on what you do if you get captured by an enemy, and he started to remember that training. He kept his head. He kept his wits about him. He began to look around and look at everything around him and his captors so that he could remember them later. And he decided he was going to start asking them questions. And his first questions were, who are you and where do you come from? Again, there was speech, but their lips did not move. And they called him Charles. They didn't call him Chuck, they called him Charles, except the elder, who called him son. Moody asked the elder, Again, who are you and where are you from? The elder replied, we are from a very specific quarter of the universe, and someday in the near future you will understand. We are explorers, historians, scientists, traders, doctors, just like you. Well, Moody was a mechanic, and he was interested in the propulsion of that object. In his letter, he said, I was thinking to myself, if I could only see the drive unit of the craft, how wonderful would that be? And before I could ask the elder to show me the propulsion, the elder took me down by elevator to the lower level of the ship. The ship had 3 levels. I was examined in the middle floor, and the engine room was below. They never took me to the top floor. And he said he felt the interior was too large compared to the exterior that he remembered seeing, before he woke up on board. He remembers the air was really thick, it was difficult to breathe, and it smelled like burnt sugar. He was told by the beings that this was just their landing craft. Their mothership was 400 miles away. So the little drawing you see here was made by Alan Levine. He was a staff member of APRO, and he had interviewed Moody quite a few times during this whole incident, asking him questions about the craft and the abductors as his memories were coming back. Levine was on a Richard Dolan podcast in December of 2023. He had 3 podcasts actually, but the very first one he spoke about Charles Moody in that. And a lot of today's information was firsthand knowledge from Alan Levine. And what I thought was interesting that Levine said in that podcast was, and he really didn't want to give the information up. Dolan had to argue with him and really, pull it out of him. And the reason for that, Levine said, well, hey, there could be people still investigating this case, and I don't want to ruin their investigation by giving away all the evidence regarding the craft and these beings. And Richard Dolan remembered him, Alan, everyone who investigated this case is dead. No one is alive that's investigating this case. So Levine said, yeah, you're right. They were not the typical grays that we usually are described in alien encounters. These creatures were soft like marshmallow. They were soft and they were wrinkly. Their skin was a whitish gray in color. They had big round eyes that were larger than ours, and they had a small white iris. Again, their heads were large and they communicated telepathically, and they knew everyone's proper names. Again, the interior of the craft had that soft edges, no squared edges, and the description of the abductors and the interior of the craft is similar to the description that Betty and Barney Hill, William Herman, and Travis Walton had described to APRO regarding their abductors and the craft that they were brought inside of. The interior of all the crafts were similar. Interior was smooth with no squared edges. And again, APRO had never discussed this publicly, so they couldn't have heard about this in the paper or no way of knowing each other that they could have shared that information amongst themselves. Myself, I went to Roswell this year in July, and Travis Walton was there, and I speak to him often when I see him. I've seen him several times. So I asked him about the interior of the craft. I told him, Mr. Walton, what was the inside? Do you remember what the inside of that craft was like? When you woke up on the table? And he says he remembers the indirect light. He didn't remember ever seeing any direct light. He remembers the smoothness. He said it was almost like melted wax. the interior of the craft. But Travis Walton, when he woke up, he wanted to fight everybody. He wanted to tear him up and get out of there. He was a lumberjack. He was a big guy and he was terrified. Charles Moody, after he got over the initial shock, he pulled himself together and he started to observe his captors and his environment so he could discuss it later with his, due to his Air Force training. The drawing you see on board, the one on the left is what Charles Moody drew of his captors. The one on the right are from the abduction of a William Herman. He was in, I believe it was Charlotte, North Carolina, and was abducted while he was out in his fields one day. You can really see by looking at them that they're, one drawing's a little better than the other, but you can see that they drew the same thing. So, here's the final timeline. I'm wrapping it up here. The timeline of the Charles Moody abduction of 1975. On August 13th, Charles Moody was abducted from the desert. On August 20th, his information regarding this was given to APRO by UFO magazine. They called Moody at home. On the 21st, Jim Lorenzen of APRO spoke directly with Moody and advised him to go to sick call due to the ongoing illness he started to have. On September 2nd, Jim Lorenzen and Wendell Stevens flew to Alamogordo and they interviewed Moody in his home and they toured the location. On September 29th, Moody tells APRO his memories were returning and that he had received orders to ship out on November 29th. On October 6th, Moody calls APRO and he said that he remembered the entire incident and using self-meditation and hypnosis. And APRO advised him to write everything down. On October 29th, unexpectedly, the ship date got moved up for the Moody family. Him and his entire family were shipped overseas to an unknown location. On November 15th, APRO receives a letter from Moody with every detail of the entire incident. Jim Lorenzen immediately called the Moody home and was trying to get a hold of them, of Charles Moody, but the phone at the home had been disconnected. He called Holloman Air Force Base, even though Moody had asked him not to call the base. He called the base and they told him he has shipped out. He's got orders. He is overseas. Stop calling for Charles Moody. And, regarding the delay, APRO published the Moody incident in their bulletin 10 months later. They published it in June of 1976 and July of 1976. And that delay was a courtesy that they gave to Charles Moody because he asked them not to publish his name. But after they could not get a hold of him, and Jim Lorenzen had military experience, he understood pretty much what had happened to Moody. They decided that by publishing his name in that article that maybe it would flush him out. Maybe he would surface, maybe they would have contact and be able to follow up, but that never happened. Moody did not report the incident to his commander. He never reported it to his commander. The only Air Force related person that he spoke to about it was that doctor who is former Air Force. Whether he gave Moody up or not, who knows? But there was possible reasons why the Moody case never made it to the newspaper. I went to the Alamogordo library and I tried to find it, and it just wasn't in any of the newspapers microfiche there for the 75 or 76. Myself, I drove to this location, this desert location, and if you see with my little cursor here, this is the town of Ruidoso. That is Sierra Blanca. That mountain's 14,000 feet high. This is to the northeast, and this is the area of La Luz. So this would have been the view that Charles Moody had that night while he was watching the Perseid meteor showers. Where you see those little clouds is the area he described that they were flying in at him, and he saw that white light. And I also did some research while I was there, because if you see my cursor again, where I'm circling, that's where Holloman Air Force Base is on the map. This is Route 70, and it's the only road. So that's how he would have came out of the base. And this is the town of Alamogordo right here, with this area here being the La Luz area where he was watching. So he was probably in this area here, which is White Sands Missile Range. But again, it's all desert. Along Route 70 here presently, there's a mobile home park called Amber Skies, but that wasn't built until 1997. It wouldn't have been part of Moody's view whatsoever when he went into the desert to watch the meteor shower. Those telephone poles you see in my picture are along what's called the relief road. There's a relief road that goes along the backside of Alamogordo. That wasn't built till 2002. So there were no street lights that would have given any white noise to what he was looking at. It was a completely black evening when he was out there. And again, like I said, this Moody story wasn't published in the local newspapers. The Lorenzens published a couple of books, and it was in them. Wendell Stevens had a big part of it in some of his books. He was a big part of the investigation of this case. But the Travis Walton incident had happened at the tail end of this, and I think they lost a little bit of sight of Charles Moody and didn't realize that he had been shipped out of town. But they were able to publish the story 10 months later and bring it to light. But it's really a very little known story. And I think when I look back on this, I think what the main reason why you don't see the Moody story, or even, back in 1964 with the Socorro incident, that was in every newspaper in the world when that happened in April of '64. 5 days later, the same object landed at Holloman Air Force Base. And again, I couldn't find that in the newspaper anywhere either. I scoured through the microfiche looking for that one. And part of the reason for that, I believe, is I found a regulation in the Air Force manual. It's an old regulation, AFR 190-6. One of the points in this regulation states that no enlisted or DOD employee may talk to the press without first notifying the Base Center Information Services Officer for any matters regarding the U.S. Air Force or anything regarded to the base. So this could be the reason that Moody was so afraid for them to call him at Holloman. This could be some of the reason why we don't find out about it in our local newspapers. APRO, it was our one source for those types of reports back in the day. So that was my presentation regarding Charles Moody. I want to thank all of our supporters who help us do this every month. And I want to thank you for watching our presentation. I hope you enjoyed it. Again, my name is Maria Tallier. You can find us on Facebook, New Mexico MUFON, or New Mexico MUFON Group. Thank you for your time today.